The reading is taken from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 16, and the heading is Cain and Abel. Adam made love to his wife, Eve. She became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Thanks be to God.
Story of Cain and Abel. I think it's a horrific story. And it's pretty haunting at the best of times. It's a story of the conflict between two brothers that ends in murder. And when you realize how oft common sibling rivalry is, you realize how accurate it is an explanation of many family relationships. But the murder, and this is perhaps what's most haunting, the murder happens over whose worship is right and acceptable to God. And it's almost as if the story is kind of a prophetic understanding of the religious conflicts that have haunted this world for centuries and centuries and centuries. Because I don't know how many people have been killed in this world and are being killed in this world over whether their worship is right or wrong. It's haunting. The text hints at things. It hints at the origins of a conflict between Cain and Abel. So we read right in the first verse of the text, we read that Adam slept with his wife, she became pregnant, she bore him a son, and said, "By the Lord's help, I have gotten a son." So when Cain is born, Eve rejoices. And then we read, she named him Cain. Later she gave birth to another son, Abel. Nothing is said about her rejoicing about Abel. Cain, she rejoices, praises God. Abel, she's silent. There's another hint of a profound difference in the life that the two brothers lived. Know that Cain was the firstborn son. He would have inherited that which his father had already developed and built up. And he lives off that which his parent, his father, has developed. That which his father worked at and cultivated, Cain takes and he develops further, but he lives off it. He doesn't have to plant the fields for the first time. His father did it all for him. So Cain has this easy, settled life among the lands that his father first cultivated. Abel has it different. Ancient people realizing that if each son, they didn't have birth control then, if each son inherited land, they would not have enough land to live off. There would not be enough land for all of them, in fact. So the younger sons had to move away, had to fend for themselves. The eldest son got the land, but not the younger sons. And so Abel would not have inherited from his father as Cain did. He would have been, as the text tells us, a herder of sheep. And we know that at that time, herders of sheep lived a nomadic life. They wandered from one place of acceptable grazing to another place where there was good grazing. And so they had no permanent place to settle, no permanent place they could call home. They didn't have it. So here we have one son who has an established, inherited, stable existence, Abel. But there is Cain, but there is another son who has this unstable, threatened existence where the norm was the survival of the fittest, the strongest, the mentally strongest. So we know there's a profound difference between these two sons, these two brothers. And Abel has it hard. Cain has it easy. Abel has it hard. And that makes him physically, emotionally, psychologically more experienced in the ups and downs and successes and failures of life. That's what happens. And so these two brothers come together. They come together to offer their sacrifices to God. Cain takes some of his harvest, and Abel takes the firstborn of one of his sheep. And Cain's sacrifice is found unacceptable to God. Abel's is found acceptable. And the text hints at this. It says, after some time, Cain brought some of his harvest and gave it as offering to the Lord. Then Abel brought the first lamb born to one of his sheep, killed it, and gave the best parts of it as an offering. Interesting terminology that. And the Lord was pleased with Abel and his offering, but he rejected Cain and his offering. Cain merely brings some of his harvest. Abel brings the firstborn lamb of one of his sheep, and he gives God the best parts of it. He gives to God of the best, where Cain just gives something that his land has produced. And I suspect that perhaps because Abel had lived a harder life, the more unstable life, the more threatened life, he realizes the importance of giving of his best, the importance of sacrifice. Because there's a question here. What is sacrifice if it doesn't really cost you? What is giving to God in appreciation for what He has done for you if it doesn't really cost you? What is it then? It's not a sacrifice. If something doesn't come at a real price to you, if you don't really feel it, it's not a sacrifice. I mean, isn't that the meaning of sacrifice? Something that is sacrificial is something that really costs you. And you see, Cain doesn't get this. He just gives something. He doesn't know how to really give because everything has come to him on a platter. He doesn't know how to give in a way that is hard and costly, that is sacrificial. The outcome of their sacrifices is that the emotionally non-developed older brother can't deal with God rejecting what He's giving him. He hasn't got the capacity to deal with it. He hasn't lived enough of life to learn how to live with rejection. He's emotionally not able to do it. And the consequences are tragic and horrific. In fact, the true horror of what happens is in verse 10. Then the Lord said, "Why have you done this terrible thing? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." In other words, the very soil of the earth itself is crying out to God about what has happened. And this is where we get to the really interesting part of the passage. And it's God's response. In a sense, God's response is expected, but in a profound sense, it's totally unexpected. It's expected because God does exact a price for what Cain has done. He casts him off the land which soaked up his brother's blood. He casts him off it. He takes away his ability to cultivate the land. He says, everything you plant from now on shall be barren. He takes away that ability of him to cultivate the land, and he leaves him where his brother was, a wanderer going from one place to another. That's what God does. Like the brother he killed, but this time he's got no home to return to. And so for the first time in his secure, privileged life, he discovers insecurity. He discovers vulnerability. He discovers threat. He cries out to God, "This punishment is too hard for me. You're driving me off the land, away from your presence. I will be a homeless wanderer." His brother had been a homeless wanderer. "I will be a homeless wanderer on the earth, and anyone who finds me will kill me." He is vulnerable for the first time in his life. For the first time in his life, he hasn't got Big Daddy to look after him and carry him. It's profound that this boy who had everything is now reduced to who his brother, whom he killed, was. A herdsman, a wanderer, with nowhere to call home. And the evil that welled up from within him, the insecurity of not being accepted as his brother was, the fear that evil and violence within him existed within others, and that which he did to his brother will be visited upon himself, that he too can be killed now. He's no longer protected, he's vulnerable, others will kill him as he killed his brother. That what he did to others will now touch his own life. suddenly he discovers that is where he's at. And it's too much for him. The realization of this profound homelessness and vulnerability is too much, and he cries out to God. And this is where the unexpected comes in. God spares his life. God does it. God does not exact from Cain that which he did to Abel. Later on in the Bible, in fact in the next book in Exodus, we find the whole God commanding the Israelites an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. God does not apply that to Cain. God somehow is merciful. He sees his plight, and God is merciful. And so God actually moves to protect him from the same violence that he inflicted on his brother. I don't know whether it was God trying to put a limit on that spiral of violence that would come out of it. I don't know if God simply understands. I think it comes out of compassion. That God sees into the very soul of Cain and is merciful. That's what I think. And so God puts a mark on Cain to warn anybody not to kill him. And so I think Cain is always marked by that violence he inflicted on his brother. He never can escape the consequences of it. But the compassion of God spares his life. And that compassion of God, it's the same compassion that moves God to become human. It's the same compassion that we see in Jesus towards others. And if we look into our own lives, we see that same compassion. And so I think this is ultimately the point of the story. That the God of compassion seeks somehow to limit the violence that can be brought upon a person. I suspect that. That through his own compassion, through his own choosing not to claim a life for a life, he somehow gives hope to everyone else. That's what I suspect it's about. That is actually what we celebrate in communion. A last reflection on the story, which I find perhaps really challenging. As I read the story, I wonder if the real point of the story is about sacrifice. Because that is ultimately what this whole story hinges on: acceptable and non-acceptable sacrifice. And so I wonder if the point of the story isn't about the nature of the sacrifices we offer to God and how acceptable they are to God. If this was the immediate factor behind Cain killing Abel, then we can't help but asking ourselves the question, it is not about the sacrifices and the offerings we give to God. We can't avoid that question. And the question is, how sacrificial are the sacrifices and offerings we offer to God? How sacrificial are they really to us? Because what is a sacrifice if it's not costly to us? What is a sacrifice to God if it doesn't come at a real price to you and I? If you and I don't feel what we are giving to God, what is it then? Because that's what sacrificial means. And that's what God demands. Amen.